mine.
Well, good evening and welcome to Late Nights with myself, Bridget Masinga, right here on Kaya FM, the home of the Afropolitan. A big shout out to Tuli for holding things down this evening once again on My Money and Me. She'll be back tomorrow. Tonight we're broadcasting live from Kaya House, and we have our second sort of outside broadcast / adding our own version of a razzle and a dazzle, and this time around we are adding it to hashtag Jazzuary 2017, hosting the final masterclass. And we've convened some fabulous people. Thank you, everybody, for coming through. A fabulous mix of great minds who are incredibly passionate about jazz, the genre, and, of course, the creative spaces as a whole. And we've got a killer lineup for you tonight as well. Our masterclasses will be presented by writer and editor Gwen Ansell, as well as Professor Michael Titlestad. And we also have Barbara Boseman coming through a little bit later, not to mention 2 live performances. In fact, we have got the Soil coming through with a fabulous performance to wrap things up for us, and we have a drumming exhibition by Sphelelo Mazibuko. So it's a packed night, and it's going to be a fabulous night. It's going to be very, very interesting, to say the least. And I think, you know what, let's first kick things off with a little something from Miriam Makeba, and then we'll come back with Gwen Ansell. Well, I think that's a perfect way to start things off tonight with the mother of incredible music and probably one of the country's forefathers of jazz, so to speak, quote unquote, Miriam Makeba. The song is a Soweto Blues, which leads us on to our first masterclass presentation, presented by the so talented Gwen Ansell, who is a writer and, of course, editor. And she spent a lifetime literally documenting jazz and the heritage thereof. And funny enough, I think I chose the song on purpose because your book is also called Soweto Blues. So let me start talking and you start doing your thing.
Thanks, Bridget. Good evening, everybody. Yeah, the book wasn't originally going to be called Soweto Blues. It originally had another title, which my American publishers felt wouldn't sell, and that title was Black Heroes. I wonder why they thought it wouldn't sell. Okay, when Lita phoned me, emailed me and said, we want you to talk about the history of South African jazz, I thought, yeah, great. And then he said, you've got 12 and a half minutes. So you're not going to get the history of South African jazz. You're going to get some thoughts on why jazz is important and why it's been particularly important in the history and the struggles of this country. And obviously we have to start with the arrival of jazz in this country, except I don't think you can talk about jazz arriving in this country. It never arrived because it was already here. American jazz, as we know, was shaped by the life experiences of African American people under slavery and Reconstruction, and the new musical landscapes they encountered when they got to America. But the music arrived in America from Africa on the slave ships. It already had African roots. Some of those enslaved people came from Angola, which is also a place where some of the people who were legally wage laborers but actually enslaved in our minds also came from. And in that sense, there are common and shared roots going back a very, very long time. If people are interested in those African roots of American jazz, then I can't think of a better book to start with than Amiri Baraka's Blues People. I think that's a great book to get thinking about Africa, America, and how jazz became the wonderful music it was. So we can say, in a sense, that when those early 78 RPM LPs, anyone remember LPs apart from me, arrived in this country, they actually were not arriving, but coming home, returning. But we've also got to remember that South African jazz itself had an extensive prehistory here. Bits of what went into our jazz came from the traditional music of many communities across the country. Bits came from church music. There were the Marabi gigs of wandering musicians with names like Toto and Hybrix and Nine Fingers. There were sophisticated touring vaudeville shows from the end of the 19th century, many of them organized by very powerful women, and concert and dance. And all of those fed into what we came to call our jazz. And if you want to read about that, and Michael and I were just saying the person who should be here tonight is Professor Chris Ballantyne, because Marabi Nights actually tells that story as well as any book I can think of. So a lot of ingredients met and mixed in the earliest South African music that sounded jazzy, and that started being recorded round about the 1930s. If you can track it down, I think an amazing place to start is with the track that's been called South Africa's first jazz track, which was recorded in 1939. And that's a track called Izikalo Zika Z-Boy, Z-Boy's Lament. I like to call it Z-Boy's Blues, from Zulu Boy Tele. Because it's an amazing record, it's beautiful music, and it tells you a lot. It demonstrates just how much went into early South African jazz. You can hear the church in it. You can hear call and response in it. You can hear 1920s American ragtime in it, and a whole lot of other things too. But the same track also, because it sounds in many ways so distant, almost alien, it also does tell us that the past really is another country. I don't think people who perhaps weren't even born when apartheid ended can really imagine quite how far away those 1920s and 1930s were and just how different things were then. And I think it was probably really hard to imagine yourself in the shoes of those early black city people. Those of you who are lucky enough still to have elderly relatives around, you actually should be asking them to tell you what things were like. And the older they are, the more you should be asking them to tell you. Because all the removals and destructions of apartheid actually destroyed huge swathes of that social and cultural history. We're never going to get it back, but at least we can try and recover what people still remember. And really, we don't know that much about those early days. And what we do know, and this is something which I think Mike is going to talk about after me, we know not from scholars, because the scholars were mostly located in apartheid universities that disapproved of such things. We know it from the poets, the novelists, the journalists like Todd Matshikiza on drum. They're the people. And Todd Matshikiza wrote a fabulous 3-part history of early South African jazz called Jazz Comes to Joburg, which, while it had a slightly tabloidy slant on gender relations, is nevertheless by far the best document that you'll ever find to tell you what those early days felt like to the people who were living through them. If we want to get a sense of how jazz developed here, we can say the 1920s represented the prehistory of the music. Golden diamonds had been discovered, the cities were starting to establish themselves and grow, all kinds of peoples and sounds were being smashed together. By the 30s, that wave of workers of all kinds coming into the cities had intensified. In the older areas of Joburg, the areas the rich whites had by then moved out of, they were already moving north. And you've got places like Doornfontein, which had been the heart of rich Joburg at one point, but by the 30s they were being deserted. You found workers moving in, mostly black workers, but actually the poor of every community. This was pre-apartheid, remember, and although there was oppression and there was segregation, there were also a lot more gaps than apartheid allowed later on. So people who needed to be near their jobs settled very often illegally in these multiply sublet former big old houses, which took the name of slum yards. And this was the era of Marabi music. This is the 30s. A beat-up old piano, maybe a squeeze box, maybe a singer, some way of making rhythm, whether it was an actual drum or just a tin filled with stones. And, of course, to go with it, homebrew, which was the only way of earning a living for women who were not supposed to be in the city at all. The men were there on sufferance. The women weren't supposed to be there at all. Men were not supposed to bring their families with them. They weren't counted in the censuses, so we don't know exactly how many of them there were. and making and brewing traditional beer was one of the few ways they had of making ends meet. This was before the big segregated townships of apartheid. The legal grounds for ending the right of black people to own land in the city were only established in 1927. The first bit of Soweto, Orlando, was only established in 1931. And by the 1940s, those two opposing currents were in full flow. All kinds of black big city culture were asserting themselves really proudly in places like Sophiatown, on the wall there. But the policy and the legal pressure to create whites-only cities was also growing. And of course, in 1948, apartheid arrived. In the same year that Todd Matshikiza, in his other identity as a piano player, and a bunch of his mates, actually decided that they were very, very tired of formulaic big band dance music and declared a new sound, which they called African jazz. So African jazz and apartheid started in just about the same year. Apartheid's removal of black urban communities during the 50s was absolutely ruthless. You see the photographs. Cops basically just threw off those lorries that were trucking people to places like Meadowlands, the books they read, the photo albums they had, even sometimes the pianos they used to play. So again, this is another source of the history we've lost. And of course, a lot of the records and the phonographs they played them on were also chucked off those lorries. People weren't allowed to take stuff with them if there wasn't room on the truck. And that's one of the reasons that jazz is so important, because as our poet laureate, Kiropetse Khositsile, has said, sound is memory. If you haven't got the material objects, you still got a bit of the sound. After 1948, apartheid had a grand project. They called it retribalization. What it meant was enforcing identities that said black urbanites who'd been in the city for generations by that time actually didn't exist in the city. They only existed under the patriarchal authority of a chief anywhere else but a city. And in those years, the black city took jazz to its heart, precisely because it wasn't just a soundtrack. And I think this is something we've got to get over. Ah, yes, jazz was the soundtrack to the struggle. It wasn't just the soundtrack. Jazz enacted the struggle. How it sounded, what people did in the social spaces around it, actually gave two fingers to apartheid. And these are the ways it did that. First, of course, jazz was urban, and it joyfully embraced and blended the wide range of community identities that you find in any city. It was the music of a non-tribal black working class that apartheid said didn't exist and shouldn't exist and couldn't exist. So you had all kinds of mixing, as always happens in the kinds of social spaces where music is made. And the music also supports another kind of mixing, the interaction, the collaging of sounds that maybe never came together before. A Sutu harmonica, an American jazz theme, a gospel voice, all those kinds of things. Secondly, jazz was sophisticated and disciplined and cosmopolitan. And apartheid's ideology was saying that Africans were simple and unreliable and instinctive and lazy and shiftless. And yet you look at a band like Peter Rizant's Merry Blackbirds, who, when they played at the Empire exhibition in 1936, white South Africans refused to believe they were African. No, they must be American, because of the high level of discipline and mastery that they brought to their music. Thirdly, jazz performance was thoughtful and ordered and professional. And at the same time, you have job reservation being brought in, based on a pseudoscience that asserted Africans couldn't handle ideas or detail or precision. So just by being a jazz musician or appreciating jazz music, you were saying, no, this isn't true. Fourthly, jazz was played and listened to and danced to at nights, whereas the law said you're only in the city, the white man's city, on sufferance during the day to do the white man's work. And finally, there's the philosophy you hear in the jazz process. Jazz is a music of both individual freedom, in impro, in solos, and also a music of collectivity and how bands work together to frame and support that impro and those solos. Jazz supports dialogue and the free exchange of ideas, democracy if you like, in the interplay between musicians and also in the shouts and the dances and the imaginings of the audience. And a writer like Percy Mabandu, for example, has documented what black audiences heard when Mankunku used the metaphor of the bellowing bull. And African culture's been layering meanings like that since the earliest praise poetry, and using that process to tell your story remains as fresh as it was in Cliptown in 1955 when the Freedom Charter was signed in a great center of jazz. Cliptown was, and the earliest township of all.
Gwen, I'm so sorry. I almost don't want to interrupt. Can we... Thank you very much. I almost don't want to interrupt because the masterclass is informative, right, and exceptional. Can we hold this thought and come back to it after the break?
Yes, of course we can.
Fantastic. I think I've already picked up a quotable that we've already tweeted. By the way, feel free to tweet hashtag Jazzuary 2017 Masterclass. And I love that you said jazz did not lend itself as solely the soundtrack of the struggle, but it was an interaction and it interacted the struggle.
It enacted the struggle. It struggled by being.
We will be back on Late Nights with myself, Bridget Masinga, and of course Gwen Ansell. And coming up as well, we have got Professor Titlestad, who's going to talk to us even more about jazz as it plays out in the world of literature. This is Kaya FM, the home of the Afropolitan. It is Meadowlands right there on Kaya FM, the home of the Afropolitan. So we continue with writer and editor Gwen Ansell as she imparts some of her thoughts and, of course, her chronicling of South African jazz in particular. And this is all, of course, our way right here on Late Nights with Bridget Masinga of wrapping up what has been a phenomenal Jazzuary 2017 with the final masterclass. So, Ms. Gwen, I hand over to you, who, by the way, told me that she's got her 12 minutes planned down to the last word.
You have 90 seconds more to suffer before you can start asking me difficult questions. Yeah, I was talking about this layering, this metaphorical use of words, ideas, symbols in African culture. And, you know, it's tied into jazz culture as well and into the jazz process. Part of it's what an American jazz scholar, Ingrid Monson, has called signifying, which is something that comes out of what happens in the black churches in the States, where you take elements from the past or elements from somewhere else or from a different context, and you add fresh and very often subversive meanings as you mix them up and use them. So when South African jazz borrowed African American musical references, which it did a lot, it was actually conjuring and asserting South African modernism. It wasn't just copying America. Let's remember how old-fashioned apartheid was. Some of the Afrikaans universities didn't allow mixed dancing, and I mean gender mixed dancing, until the 1970s. You know, this was not a forward-looking regime we're talking about here. Meanwhile, jazz and the fashions and the styles that went with it, the Florsheim shoes, the Borsalino hats, all of that stuff, were all actually saying, we're here, like it or not, and we're here to stay. And actually, Nansindoda, we're coming to get you. And that's probably one of the reasons that jazz did become a genuinely popular music here in South Africa. It's one of the very few countries outside the USA where that happened for a time. And the way jazz foregrounds what I'm deliberately going to call cleverness, and I mean that in all the senses in which we use the word clever, and the way it foregrounds creative, critical intelligence, and the way it foregrounds musical mastery, I think are the reasons why it stays an important music, right up to Fees Must Fall and today.
Right. Good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be speaking to you tonight. It's also something of a relief that Gwen has left, because Gwen and a few other historians really carry the banner of jazz in this country in very important ways. The work that I've been asked to discuss derives from a book that I wrote called Making the Changes. And I started looking at the book and realized that I'd forgotten everything that I said in it. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to extract a couple of things that I remember. And at first I am going to speak about quite abstract ideas about jazz. And then I'll speak more specifically about the writing about jazz and the literature of jazz, which Gwen earlier on spoke about a kind of informal musicology. And she's absolutely right, because jazz comes to us through a very particular kind of literary tradition. And I'd like to speak about that. But let me speak in quite an abstract way about three aspects of jazz. The first, again, something that Gwen mentioned, is this idea of jazz as something that involves transfers across what Paul Gilroy calls the Black Atlantic. So obviously jazz is formed in these exchanges, and we've got an entire tradition of black identity and black history which is formed through those exchanges. And we need to be constantly aware of what those exchanges entail and the kind of richness of those exchanges. Right. Paul Gilroy goes as far as to say that black culture is actually formed in the hold of slave ships, that a very particular kind of cultural formation happens in that place. And it's really in that place that you have an exchange of language, but also you have an exchange of culture and of music. So the first thing is this thing of the Black Atlantic that I think is utterly important in understanding both jazz and writing about jazz. The second idea, and this might just interest you on the level of how jazz is actually performed, and essentially it argues that there are two ways in which art can be made. The one way in which art can be made is through the use of a blueprint. And you can use the idea of a architect most creatively in this way, because an architect plans exactly what the building is going to be. All right, so the blueprint is set up and then the blueprint is executed. What happens with jazz, though, just like with the paintings of somebody like Jackson Pollock, what happens with jazz is you've got a note or a phrase which is played. And what happens then is that the artist builds on the phrase that has been played. So you don't have a blueprint being executed. What you've got instead is a process of organic development based on what has already been done. Right? The significance of that in relation to writing will become apparent in a moment. And the last thing that I want to say, which is a kind of abstract idea, is the idea of a man called Michel Desserteau, who said that essentially you can have two ways of looking at the world. And he says one is like if you were to stand on a high-rise building and look down on a city, and he says you would essentially see a map. But the second way is to walk through the city. So not to look at the city from a distance, but to walk through and get a picture of the city as you travel. Now those three ways, if we think about them, give us a strong idea about how writing works and how writing about jazz works in particular. And the reason I emphasize them is that if we think back, starting perhaps with writing of the 1950s, what you had in the work of people like Machakiza and others, Bloke Modisani, etc., you had this idea of creating a vital language, a new language, made out of not just looking at a map of the world, right, but actually using Black Atlantic ideas and then also managing to develop creatively a language. And that language became, in the case of Todd Matshikiza, that language became known as Matshikiz. And he tried to develop a language that swings. All right, so if you think about jazz as swinging, Todd Matshikiza's language swung. All right, he would use particular words, particular ideas, and he would essentially develop a language which imitated jazz in very particular ways. And you might say, why is that important? What is at stake? And the main thing, of course, is that it's a political language, because it's cutting across the traditional language of South African English. And it's making a new language, a township idiom, that allows him to express things that he could otherwise not express. So it's an invention of a language that is vital, that is political, and that actually gives a unique voice, not only to Todd Matshikiza, but also to the other writers of drum. So it's this idea of inventing language that becomes so important in the 1950s. I then became interested in the writing around King Kong, because King Kong encouraged a particular kind of writing as well, which took its inspiration from drum. But the interesting thing is there was white conservative writing and there was township writing about King Kong. And the interesting thing about white conservative writing is that it in many respects resembled conservative American writing about jazz. You probably know that American writing about jazz was divided between a very vitriolic and critical idiom on the part of the white press, and what you had then on the part of African American writing was a way of salvaging and presenting jazz as a unique voice of the people. And the same thing happened about King Kong. If you read Die Burger and other newspapers, there's this incredible sense of racist representation of the artists singing and acting in King Kong, while you've got the sense of liberation in black writing about the jazz opera. And of course you've got this very, very troubling sense that eventually it would result very fundamentally in exile, right? That the collapse of King Kong, rather tragically, would lead to many core members of the cast staying away from South Africa after the jazz opera traveled to London. I just want to speak a little about this exile, because a large number of South African writers wrote about South African jazz in exile and the exile of South African black people. And it was the most remarkable writing. We've got incredible writing by Eskia Mpatlele, for example, in a very neglected novel called The Wanderers. But there's a great deal of other writing. For example, writing about Johnny Diane and various other jazz musicians who suffered incredibly in exile. I don't know if you know that there was this sort of sense of mental collapse on the part of a large number of South African musicians. Johnny Diane, of course, suffered from schizophrenia, and other members of the Blue Notes suffered very, very significantly in their time during the time of exile. So I just need to move on a little. Apart from this writing about exile, which I found absolutely intriguing and terribly depressing, we then move on to the period of the 1960s, and what we've got then is a kind of questioning of white and black relations. And you've got, for example, some of you may know this idea of white people going to Sophiatown and other townships to experience that culture. Right? That happens also, interestingly enough, in the Harlem Renaissance during American history about jazz. So you've got a similar process where a lot of writers, many of them white writers, begin to write about South African jazz. In some ways, it lessens South African jazz and the significance of South African jazz. But we do at least get a sense of exchange and a sense of people engaging one another and different cultures in the townships over that period of time.
Professor, if I can halt you there for a second. I know I always seem to interrupt just as the thoughts are getting far more fabulous. We just need to take a quick break and then we come back and we're going to wrap things up with Professor Michael Titlestad. Lita's like, stop being British on me. It's Titlestad. We're in South Africa. And then we're going to hear from Barbara Boswell, who's a senior lecturer at the School of Literature, Language and Media at Wits. Professor Michael Titlestad will wrap up his thoughts for us, and then we are going to get into a short but fabulous discussion about Toni Morrison's novel Jazz with Barbara Boswell.
Well, thank you, Matt. Just to conclude, the period after the one that I was discussing becomes one of very specific militance. And we have, in the 1970s, and the start of the 1980s, a representation of jazz which becomes both strident and which takes a very particular stance in the fight against apartheid. And I'm thinking, for example, Mangane Sirote's To Every Birth Its Blood is an absolutely remarkable novel, half of which concerns jazz and looks specifically at jazz culture as resistance. And then recently we have a series of texts concerning jazz, many of which are interactions between musicians and artists. And perhaps my favorite is Zimingwane's and Lefifi Tladi's work together, which was absolutely remarkable. But certainly jazz has become both a social, a political, and an individual art form, where people gather a sense of themselves and their culture and their history. And what they do is they manage to build that into a form of not just expression, but also a form of being.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us this evening and enlightening us a bit further. It is late nights right here on Kaya FM, Jazzuary 2017, the masterclass as presented to you this evening by incredible speakers who are well-versed and highly respected in the field of jazz and, of course, in the field of literature and media.